College had a funny way of making me come to terms with a lot of my weaknesses and my shortcomings, and oftentimes in a very quick manner. One of the things that I quickly realized about myself is that I am easily distracted by the people around me, by my phone, by my own thoughts, pretty girls if they're around. I am easily distracted. So I developed a lot of different tricks and methods to help me stay focused, or really more accurately to block out distractions. And the most effective one by far that I found over time was classical music. To this day, if I am really trying to get something done, or if I'm trying to overcome a serious case of writer's block, or if I just need to tune everything out and churn out a couple papers for grad school real quick, I put in my headphones and I go to one of 3 or 4 different playlists that I've made of different variations of classical music, and I just escape, because for some reason that just helps me focus. If you listen to much classical music, you will eventually come across something that's called a requiem. For example, one of the most famous requiems is Mozart's Requiem in D minor, and it is, to put it lightly, not a happy piece of music. If you listen to it, it's about 45, 55 minutes of cutting strings, harsh woodwinds, and this foreboding crescendo that comes in and out and interweaves through the entire piece of music, and it just feels so weighty. It's not a happy piece. It's not hopeless, but it's not happy. And that makes sense, of course, because a requiem in any composition like that one that sets to music a religious text that would be appropriate at a funeral. It is a song for death. It's an offering to mark and set apart that inevitable culmination of mortality that we call death. And though requiems are most common in Catholic traditions, most of us have probably unknowingly heard one while attending a funeral. Some of us have probably sang things that could be labeled a requiem, though we tend not to call them that in our faith tradition. You see, we all mark death when it comes close to us. We mark death through tears. In funerals, we mark it with songs and stories, and through flowers and donations in lieu of flowers. We mark death by wearing black clothing and shared reflections of lives well lived. Archaeology and inescapable centrality of death culture in the human experience. It's just everywhere. As far back as you can look, Thomas Long, in his book, Accompany Them with Singing, which is a book about funerals, it's real light and fun reading if you're ever looking for something before bed one night. He says, human death has never been simply a fact. It has always been a mysterious ocean, summoning those left standing on the shore to stammer out convictions about life and wonder and what lies over the horizon. And so many of us are having to come to terms with this in real time right now. If 2020 has done anything for our world, it has brought many of us face to face with how we mark death, having lost 1.34 million people worldwide just to COVID. And that doesn't even touch on the other ways that people have died in this year's deaths that we're all too familiar with, from cancer and heart conditions and suicide. We try to find ways to honor and acknowledge the deceased during a time when our normal ceremonies are largely not possible. So we live stream funerals, and some local news station read off the names of those who've passed in their city or their county that day, followed by a moment of silence. We share our hearts and our pictures and our videos on social media, holding on to what we have left, acknowledging that which we once had is no more. And those are just a few things. Those are just a few memorials that are happening in this country at this time. You look back in history at the pyramids of Egypt, in the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, or you look at the Zagros Mountains where pollen is found in and on millennium-old graves that's there because it was left by funeral wreaths on those graves. All these things remind us that death has always moved us. And how death moves us is interesting. What we do, how we respond when someone close to us dies, matters in part because it reveals not only our emotions, but also it reveals our most deeply held conviction. Thomas Long again says, what we do when the shadow of death falls across our life etches in the dust of material life a portrait of our sense of the sacred. So, for the next few lessons that we'll have together when I speak, we're going to consider what seems to be this required requiem of grief. Tonight is the introduction, so we're not going to get really deep into this yet, but next time we'll pull back the layer a bit more and begin to address the question of how we grieve well. Because I think what we'll see together is grief in some ways is neutral and full of potential. But that potential can be positive or negative. So how do we realize in a positive light grief? And we'll also ask the question how we can help others when they grieve. And we'll discuss what we can expect from life after death, what waits for us on the other side of mortality, and how that shapes our grief here and now. And I understand that this is not the feel-good series of the year. It stands, I think, in stark contrast to a lot of what we've done together when I've gotten to teach, whether it be the Monarch series or the Open Doors series. This is very different, but I think it is absolutely essential. In fact, one of the few people that I told I was doing this, I won't name them because I think it would embarrass them, but they responded with, nope, not excited for that at all. And I get it. I totally understand. I've got mixed feelings about all of this myself, but I think this is something we need to talk about because it is something that we cannot avoid. No matter how hard we try, and though you and I may not be in a place right now where grief is in us in a big way, where death is not super close to us, it will only ever be a matter of time before we're there. And if we can enter into that space thoughtfully, with our wits about us and with God's will in our mind, we will travel through that valley, I think, so much more successfully. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge that for every one of us who is not suffering with grief right now, there are probably 2 or 3 in our church family who are. Because death is certain, and because of that, grief is certain as well. We'll talk more about that in a second, but what I want to do first is I want to get around this topic a little bit and poke at it from a few different angles. And that first thing we're going to look at is a text. It's the text of the book of Ecclesiastes, specifically chapter 7. Thomas Long's book on funerals is probably more uplifting than the book of Ecclesiastes. Just going to shoot straight with you. If you only have these 2 books to choose from for some morbid reason, good luck to you. I hope you have a good night. Ecclesiastes is one of the most depressing books ever written. Probably top 2 most depressing books in the entire Bible. I've heard from some 40 and 50-year-old friends of mine that the older you get, the more you like Ecclesiastes because it just makes a whole lot of sense as you progress in life. That is simultaneously encouraging and disappointing to me. But that's really never here nor there. So the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 7. This is a book that is written by a wise man who was not just given an extra measure, but an extraordinary measure of wisdom by God. And yet that wisdom did not seem to keep him from doing, at times, very stupid things. So we see this progression where as he gets towards the end of his life, as he turns around and looks back and reflects on his life, we specifically see reflections on a life lived without God. And there's this one passage in Ecclesiastes 7 that no matter what your perspective on God is tonight, in this very moment, it holds so much truth and such good counsel Ecclesiastes 7 verse 2 says, "It is better to go to a house of mourning than go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart." Solomon says if you've got two invitations and you've only got one Saturday and both these events are overlapping and one is a wedding and one is a funeral, Solomon says you should go to the funeral because it's better to enter the house of mourning than it is to enter the house of feasting. And he tells us why, as counterintuitive as that seems to be true. He says, because death is the destiny of everyone. And now everyone wants to be reminded of that. But I think just about everyone knows that. At least everyone above the age of 15 has come to terms with that, I think. Death is the destiny of everyone living. And the living should take this to heart. Have you ever noticed that? That death is just coming. And it's not even a matter of whether you're going to die or not. I mean, Jesus might surprise us with timing and come back and take us before the end of our lives, but barring that, you will die. And perhaps you'll die sooner than you think. God says you should think about that. He's not saying you should worry about that, but he is saying you should think about that. Solomon says, think about this, living people. You won't be living forever here. And that's interesting, I think. Not only that death is a reality, but that we mark death the way that we do. Like I said, we have these pyramids and ziggurats and floral wreaths and funerals and dirges and requiems, right? All of these things we heap up at the feet of death because we feel like it can't pass by without us acknowledging its presence. In fact, you read the Bible and death is not just everywhere as it is, but mourning death. The occasion of death, rituals surrounding the event of death are everywhere in Scripture, especially in the Old Testament. And we get this sense as we read through the Hebrew literature that mourning to God, that to him mourning is extremely important. That not only is it true that we do create these occasions around death, but that it's also the case that we should create these occasions around death. Like Solomon says, if there's a house of mourning and you could go, it would be good for you to go. And you should take what you see and you feel and what you remember or realize or are reminded of. You should take that to heart. But here's my question in all of this. And this is a question that's been rattling around in my head for months, and especially over the past couple of weeks. Why do we grieve? Not just because death is sad and not just because we love the person who died. I want to get deeper than that. I'm wondering, why is it that we grieve? Because here's what I know. I know God created all of this. All of it, every single part of it was his idea. Everything from storm clouds to trees to photosynthesis. And then you get into the realm of human beings and in our makeup, both physically and emotionally and spiritually. All of it is completely and totally architectured by God. Opposable thumbs, great idea. Also, coincidentally, God's idea. Kneecaps, great idea. Have you ever seen a penguin try and walk? They're real bad at it. The reason why? They don't have kneecaps. God gave us kneecaps. Because it was his idea. I'm a big fan of that. Everything and all the pieces and the parts that make you and make me human are designed by, dreamt up in the mind of an omnipotent, omniscient creator, God himself. Which makes me wonder, then, when someone I love dies, and I just feel broken. And I feel this pain that is from the deepest parts of me. What is that? Why did God make it that I can't escape emotions when death gets close to me? Any human who experiences death close to them and has no emotional reaction, we see that as an anomaly. We see that as someone who has emotions that they need help getting in touch with. We recognize that it is just intrinsically human to hurt when people close to us die. My question is, why, God, would you make it that way? Why would you engineer this type of mechanism inside of us? You knew that death was coming, right? So why would you do it that way? Yeah, and originally it wasn't in God's plan, and I think that is important to remember. Death is not a part of the universe until man sins in the garden and brings death into the world by the way of the fall, and then everything remains messed up in these large, deep, very systemic ways continued until the end of time. But I just find myself thinking a lot of the time, God, you knew this was coming, and still you made it so that when it did happen, I would just feel so much. Why couldn't you have made it painless for me? When close friends and mentors and family die, that would have served me really well over the past few weeks. But he engineered us so that we weep. So that I feel this feeling that's unlike anything else. And I just find myself wondering, God, what are you up to with grief? I think you feel it too, and we feel it because God has made us to feel it. And I don't know for sure what was in God's mind when he created us with the capacity for grief. I don't know why it's so deeply ingrained into every single one of us, but I suspect a couple of things. And those things I'm reminded of when I read this passage in Psalm 126. We don't know the exact context for this particular psalm. It's possibly the deliverance of Israel, the people of God, from Babylonian captivity, which they were in for decades, a deliverance that was led by Ezra and other strong religious figures of their day. But whatever the exact context of this psalm is, it's a time that's marked by loss and by mourning. The people are crying out to God, looking for him for renewal and healing and hope. And here is their prayer in Psalm 126, starting in verse 4. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. The Negev is a large desert in the southern region of Palestine. It is hot, it is dry, it is barren. It is a place where streams of refreshing and renewal would be more than welcomed. They would be an absolute necessity to make it by. So he says, restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. You are the only thing that can get us through this, is what Israel is saying. And then these beautiful statements are made in Psalm 126, verses 5 through 6. He said, those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves. Sheaves are just bundled harvests. It's the idea that they've taken so much, they've gotten so much, that they're having to bundle it up and carry it together. They'll receive sheaves. They'll return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. See, this is a prayer said by hurting people to a God who they truly believe can and will help them. And what's interesting is, this prayer wouldn't have been said if these people weren't hurting. You might be familiar with a book called Watership Down. It's a book about a bunch of rabbits. I've got some grade A book recommendations for you guys tonight. Watership Down is this story where there's this community of rabbits, right? And these wild rabbits get tossed in with these other rabbits. And the wild rabbits are used to just surviving by the skin of their teeth. They're gritty and they're dirty and their fur is matted, and they find themselves in this place with other rabbits, right? But those rabbits are different than they are. They're sleek and they're fat and they're relaxed. They have nothing to worry about. They've never wanted for anything. And so the wild rabbits ask the others, what's going on? And the others say that they simply don't know what's happening. This is all they've ever known. Why would they question it? And the wild rabbits begin to notice that every once in a while, one of those sleek, fat, relaxed rabbits just disappears. And that trend goes on and on and on. So eventually, these outsider rabbits go and they ask, what is going on with these rabbits that disappear? And the sleek rabbits respond, we don't know. It just happens from time to time. And you see, for the wild rabbits, the death of the sleek rabbits caused them to wake up. It alerted them to a reality that was not good. And this, I think, is one of the biggest potentials for death for us. It will, if we allow it to. Grief will remind us that death should not be here, because it was not a part of the plan. And it is here because of sin, and it is not destined to remain forever. Whenever someone dies and you feel the feeling of grief, it is God saying to you, death is wrong. It is an enemy. It should not be here. It points us, this grief, towards a Savior who is the only one who can help, the only one who can rescue us, not just from the pain of death around us, but from the reality of death in our own souls. If we let a funeral be that for us, a reminder that this is not what the world should be, that fallen is not forever, then it is the case that it would be better for us to enter a house of mourning and be reminded of a truth that is easy to forget when everything is comfortable and we are well nourished and we are well taken care of. We grieve death because God wants us to remember that death is an enemy. It is a marauder. It is a thief. It is an interloper. It should not be here. And every time one of us stands beside the grave and sheds a tear, we mourn not only the person we lost, but also, whether we realize it or not, we mourn the fall of man. We mourn the time when death entered the world, and we yearn for the time when it will be forever vanquished by Christ. Not only that, I think God gave us grief, not just as a reminder, but as a tool, as this mechanism by which we're able, I think, to process death and begin healing anew. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, there's a scene where this character named Ross delivers this terrible news to this other character named Macduff. And Macduff's wife and children have been killed, all of them by an attack on his castle. And Macduff receives this news, and he really doesn't say much. He doesn't really react at all. And there's this other character named Malcolm who's just watched all of this unfold. And he's seen this, and he's heard this terrible news. And it hits him, and he sees Macduff not reacting to it. And eventually he can't hold back anymore. He can no longer be silenced. And he says, "Give sorrow words." The grief that does not speak knits up the o'erfraught heart and bids it break. In other words, he says, give voice to your pain, because there's healing in that. And if you grieve and you do not say anything, you will not heal, and your heart stays broken. There is a cleansing power in grief and in tears. They hurt, but they can be good. They close up cracks and mend fences. I think that's why you hear people talk about having a good cry, which is one of those things that when you think about it, you go, what? like a good cry. Like usually when you cry, it's because something terrible has happened. But it's a real thing because God gave us grief, and it would benefit us to remember that there are things that he would like for us to do in our grief. And I think more importantly, there are things that he wants to do in every one of us when we grieve. If we can get that, if we can take that and internalize it and take it with us, we won't grieve like others who Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, do so with no hope. We will enter into a house of mourning, and somehow, surprisingly, we will be blessed, and we will be, as we go out weeping, carrying seed with us to sow, and eventually we will in fact gain returns with a harvest. Mortality is a very real thing. And it is ever present. And it is ever true. But it is so hard for all of us to grapple with, whether it be for our own sakes or the sakes of those close to us. We run from it. I'm encouraging you. More importantly, God is encouraging you to turn and face it. Because he's trying to do something in every single one of us when we grieve. Tonight, you have the opportunity to find joy in your grief, to embrace salvation in lieu of death. I hope you're ready for that. Because one way or the other, we all have to come to terms with our eventual end. And we all have to be ready for that day. If you're not, we'd love to help you get ready. We'd love to tell you about the escape plan that God planned and set in place for every single one of us and is made freely available to every single one of us at any point in our lives. And you might have done that already, but you found yourself hurt. You grieve and you suffer and you need support and love from your church family. We have plenty of that to give. We are commanded by God to give that to you. If there is anything we can do for you tonight, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?